So last week we spoke about biblical justice. Is this on?
Move it up.
Is it good? Move it up. There we go. Last week we spoke about what does the Bible have to say about justice. We talked about distributive justice and communicative justice. Not communicative, communicative justice. So this week what I want to do is now describe what is social justice, which is also critical theory. It has many different names. So what I want to do is this new vision of justice, I want to now compare it to biblical justice. But I'm going to spend some time describing it first. So every culture needs a cult. So it needs a, quote, cult, right? A common set of values and beliefs that serve as a glue to keep it together. So the glue that used to hold Western civilization together was the Judeo-Christian worldview. That worked for a long time, and obviously it's the best one. It gave the West an overarching narrative for justice and a sufficient ground for human dignity. Now, and I want to say that it wasn't just a narrative, it was the true narrative. That's why it worked so well. But through a series of worldview shifts, starting in the 1600s, that I won't necessarily get into, I don't think we have time, like it or not, the biblical worldview is no longer a major shaping influence in our culture, in Western civilization. It's still there, but it's no longer the main one. Karl Marx, you guys have all heard of him, created the beginnings of a new worldview, or you could say even a religion, to replace the Judeo-Christian worldview as the West's new cult. As I mentioned last week, Marxism has taken over our culture at every level of influence. Big media, the university is completely Marxist, the state universities. Entertainment, you'll see it all over entertainment. So Marxism itself can be considered a worldview. It describes who we are, what's wrong with the world, and then it prescribes a fix and what, quote, better would look like if we could achieve something that's better. Marxism gives us all of that. It's not right, but it attempts to give us all that. So in other words, like Christianity, Marxism answers the basic questions that any worldview does. It redefines justice as something very different from biblical justice. So my intent today is to explain Marx's view of justice and then compare it to biblical justice. So the basic idea of Marxism is that it divides all humanity into two basic categories. So every single human being in the world can be divided into these two categories. You are either an evil oppressor or you are an innocent oppressed. So you're either an evil oppressor or you're an innocent oppressed. So I guess you could put like the oppressor is on the top, the oppressed is on the bottom, underneath their boot. This is called the social binary. So binary means two. So the social binary is, again, oppressor and oppressed. So if Marx is right, each person in this room is either an evil oppressor or one of the innocent oppressed. So each of you would fit into one of those categories in some way. So Marxism, the scholars talk about there being a Marxism 1.0. So the first try at Marxism, basically. We have older versions of Windows, the newer versions are better, right? So this is Marxism 1.0, the failed version. So in Marxism 1.0, the oppressor The people in the oppressor category would be landowners, owners of the means of production, so factory owners, and employers. So those would be the oppressors, the ones with the boot. The oppressed would be renters, those who rent land, or houses, apartments, factory workers, and employees. Those are the two different groups. So oppressors create and sustain social, legal, and political conditions which enable them to control the lion's share of wealth and resources in a society. They find themselves in a, quote, privileged, remember we talked about privilege last week, they find themselves in a privileged position. They inherit advantages that they did nothing to deserve, but are theirs simply because they are born into the ruling class. The oppressed, contrarily, find themselves in the inescapable condition of poverty and social abuse. So, a little bit about moral guilt. Why do I attach the guilty oppressed and the innocent, the guilty oppressor and the innocent oppressed? The oppressed victims are, by definition, morally innocent, by Marx's definition. The oppressors are morally guilty. Legal and moral innocence or guilt is determined by which identity group you are in, oppressed or oppressor. Legal and moral innocence are not determined by your individual actions. So, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but let me say it again. Innocence and guilt are not determined by your individual actions, but by which group do you belong to. So sin and guilt are seen as collective rather than personal and individual. Again, sin and guilt are seen as collective rather than personal and individual. So the God, small g, of Marxism asks you one question at the judgment seat. And here it is. Are you in the oppressed identity group or are you in the oppressor identity group? The answer to that question determines whether you are guilty morally or innocent morally. So, according to Marx, the only way, let me stop there. Are there any questions? This particular thing took me a long time to figure out. It's a difficult concept. Are there any questions? What's that?
Is there a middle ground? Can you be part of both parties?
In Marxism 2.0, there can be. But there wasn't with Marx's original theory. You're either part of the oppressed or you're part of the oppressor group. But we'll see that with Marxism 2.0, there are levels of guilt that can be there. So according to Marx, the only way to bring justice to a society is through the unification of the oppressed against the ruling class oppressors by way of violent revolution.
So, quick question on that. So, in some societies, was there not a structure that lent itself to understanding it that way? I mean, do you not have sometimes the different classes of? You do have the ruling class, and you did have the peasant class, right? You did have that. So, you didn't have necessarily a middle class. You didn't have the ease of mobility. Was there not something that was just being observed that was then given a definition and looked at in a certain way, that it was, if you were in the upper class, if you were in the ruling class, you were automatically viewed that that was just the way the structures of some societies were, right?
Right. Well, I think that particularly in Russia, itself, I think that there are several things about their culture that set them up previously to view the world, to accept Marx's view of the world, and I think that I'm reading a book right now by Rod Dreher called "Live Not by Lies," and I don't claim to be prepared to speak about that, but there were several things that were happening in Russian culture itself that let this view rise up and become popular throughout the entire society. So it wasn't just, and it was true that there probably were oppressive landowners, and that there were oppressive factory owners, oppressive employers. So that probably was true and was many people's experience. But I think that their solution to solving that did not solve it, and in a sense, it was not God's way. So their solution, I think you can probably understand it, but it didn't work. It didn't give them what they were looking for, the utopia that they were looking for. So the way that this worked itself out, well, I don't know if I finished that. So violent revolution. So justice, according to Marx, is the stripping away of the wealth, political power, and privilege of the oppressor class and giving it to the oppressed class by whatever means necessary. And I think what they discovered is that they couldn't get rid of the oppressive class. You see that. They just flipped who the oppressor was, and they continued to live under oppression.
Kelly, can you continue to speak to that a little bit? That's an extremely important, I think, element. The solution for Marxism is what? You have the oppressor and the oppressed. What was their solution?
The solution is to take it like this and go like this. So you have the oppressor and the oppressed, but it takes violence because these people aren't willing to give up their land, their houses, their factories. So it generally takes violence. They flip it like this, and generally it's very violent, bloody, and they think that the oppressed are now going to be not willing to become oppressors. Does that make sense?
Well, because
they think that they don't have an accurate view of the sinfulness of human hearts. So when they flip it like that, they think everything's going to be better. But what they discover is that new repressors arise out of those that used to be oppressed, and they take over, and all of a sudden you need a new revolution, and then another revolution, and they call it this oscillation. The way Marx described it is that there's an oscillation, a revolution, continual revolution and each side is supposed to get a little less oppressive until, you all of a sudden come out at the top into utopia, where there's no ruling class, there's no hierarchies, there's no police force, because it's not needed. Everyone has the equal amount of property and resources and equal amount of work to do. It comes out of that. So it's a utopia that was promised to the Russian people, and at that point in their lives, that was a very attractive promise.
So it sounds like there's two features of that. The oppressed are seen to be morally superior, so that in their takeover, in their violent reversal,
they're going to be great.
The assumption is they're going to improve. They're going to take society that was bad and they're going to make it so much better
because they're not selfish.
They're not selfish. And then the second part
they're innocent.
That's right. They're innocent.
Yes.
But what I'm definitely the word that comes to mind when I hear that is revenge. They're seeking their own revenge to take it out on their oppressors.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yes, and it requires the power of the state. So I think of it, this idea that you have the oppressors and the oppressed. The oppressors can't, or the oppressed really can't do anything without a shepherd. I think of the whole process needs a shepherd, and the shepherd is the state with guns. They're the ones that help flip it on its head. You can't do it without the state. essentially, without a takeover of the state. So they take wealth, political power, privilege from the oppressor class, and they give it to the oppressed class by whatever means necessary. So often that means violence. And this is the very heart of ideological social justice, is that the oppressors get to take stuff from the oppressed. So the way this worked itself out during the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia is that you may have been a landowner who was kind, reasonable, and generous to your renters. And in my mind, there's no doubt that there probably were people like that. You may have been a factory owner that paid your employees on time and for what they were worth, but according to Bolshevik identity politics, you would have been seen as guilty and worthy of death simply because of which identity group you belong to, not because of your individual guilt or innocence. Martin Latsis was the chief of the Ukrainian secret police, and he was so a year after the revolution, they instituted what was called the Red Terror, which was essentially mass murder of the bourgeoisie, the oppressor class. Tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of people killed in this. So this is what he had to say. He says, "We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not look in the file for incriminating evidence to see whether or not the accused rose up against the Soviets with arms or words. Ask him instead to which class he belongs." Let me say that again. Ask him instead to which class he belongs. What is his background, his education, his profession? These are the questions that will determine the fate of the accused. That is the meaning and essence of the Red Terror. So that was a direct quote from a man who was actually carrying this through after the Bolshevik Revolution. So Leviticus 19:15 says this, to remind you from last week: "You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor." So you can see the very heart of Marxist justice, of ideological social justice, is partiality. It is the very heart of social justice. It is a sin that God hates. Friedrich Hayek puts it this way: the idea of social justice is that the state should treat people unequally in order to make them equal. Let me say that again. The idea of social justice is that the state should treat people differently, or should treat different people unequally in order to make them equal. So what I've been describing is Marxism 1.0, classical Marxism. And it has been tried multiple times in the 20th century, with the result of rampant poverty and the death, imprisonment, and oppression of hundreds of millions of people. Despite all this, Marxism is still with us. Although it has rebranded itself, as we will see, Marx's deadly theory is still the most influential worldview in the West today.
Why do you think that is? What is so attractive to people about Marxism? Or maybe that should be a question for the audience.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking it is.
Why do you think it's so attractive? Why is it so a lot when millions upon millions of people have been killed? Do we have
Yeah, John has it.
contributor? You like to get other people's stuff?
It is the mainstreaming of envy, of covetousness, yeah.
Elliot, let's bring it up to more or less Mark. I don't think that, I think we all.
They won't be able to hear you over here.
I'm thinking about the American Indian. Look what we did to those folks. They were very, very intelligent. They were not book learned, but they learned everything from the land. If you do any studies about the American Indian, they were very, very smart. We took their land away from them, and we kept on suppressing them more and more, and they're still doing it today. I also think about the Irish when they came over from the famine. My family is Irish, some of them. Some are Polish. They were suppressed in New York. As soon as the men got off the boat, they were sent to war. They had no idea what was going on. It's just that the Union needed more soldiers to fight. So we are still suppressing in our society. You can think about Russia, but think about what's happening here on our property, on our country, and what's happening now.
Yes, and I think that's an important point, is that none of this is to say that oppression doesn't exist, that racism doesn't exist, that all of this doesn't actually happen. What I want to argue is that social justice is not the solution. Social justice does not fix it. It makes it worse. It makes it much worse.
And as I said, the issue of covetousness, and that goes to all types of oppression, right? That element of, I'd be happy to take someone else's stuff, and that's a very appealing motivation to some people, right? To say, would I like to have more? Sure, I'd like to have more, and it's being offered through a particular means, and that's what that's getting at. That's why it's so, while millions of people die from this type of thinking, it continues to live on because of the sin of covetousness in man's heart that says, I would like to get other people's stuff, right? I would like to reverse the order. I'd like to be the boss and not the employee. That's
it's a breakdown of hierarchy, of authority too. So a new generation of Marxists rose up. They were called the Frankfurt School. And they attempted to reboot the Marxist movement, and they were very intentional that we want this to replace Christianity. See, Marx didn't necessarily want to replace Christianity. He just wanted to economically improve the plight of the poor through an awful means. These people intentionally wanted to replace Christianity. And I just learned, even just today, that many of them fled the Nazi regime. Many of these scholars, and they ended up in American universities, invited by John Dewey, the father of school systems here in the United States. So it has been around for a while. So this new generation of Marxists rose up to reboot the movement. They created what is called Marxism 2.0, which is also called neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. So this new version of the theory has been incubating in our universities in the USA and Europe under the broad heading of critical social theory. Critical social theory. It's been doing that for decades, and it is now starting to go mainstream, very mainstream. So Marxism 2.0, or neo-Marxism, keeps the idea of the oppressed, of the social binary, of the oppressed and the oppressor classes, but they expanded beyond, they expanded beyond economic categories to include other kinds of inequalities between other types of groups, including ethnic groups, genders, and also gender identity groups, to name a few. The result is the same. As Nancy Pearcey explains, just as in classic Marxism, The proposed solution is to raise your consciousness, i.e., in other words, help you to become aware of yourself as an oppressed group. Then it encourages you to rise up against your oppressor. So some of these, I'll just explain some of the isms that are identified with these categories. Racism. So the oppressor is the white person, and the oppressed is anyone who's not white. So when you hear them call them POCs, people of color, that basically is part of this theory. To call them people of color is basically anyone who's not white. So they're identified POCs as the oppressed group. Sexism, biological men would be the oppressors, and biological women would be the oppressed. Transgender oppression, that would be I would be a gender conforming biological man and biological women. And the oppressed group would be transgender or gender queer or intersex people. And I'm not exactly sure what the difference between all those are. But, heterosexism. So the privileged group would be heterosexual people, and the oppressed would be lesbians and gay men. Classism. Now, that is classical Marxism, we already talked about. Ableism is, able-bodied people are the oppressors, and the handicapped are the oppressed. And there's religious oppression is also, that is, I'm actually reading these categories out of a teacher training textbook. It is called Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice, second edition. So our teachers are they're all in the schools of education. So religious oppression. The privileged group is Christians in that one. And the oppressed are Jews, Hindus, or anyone who is not a Christian. So the Christians need to be risen up against. And there are some others, I won't go into all of them, but that one is on the religious. The religious perspective is in every list that I found. That Christians are the oppressors, and every other group is the oppressed. Every other religious group is the oppressed.
And Kelly,
Yeah.
correct me if I'm wrong, but if we're going back to what we just talked about on the Marxist side, it has nothing to do with actual individual actions or attitudes towards other people. It's simply the category to which you belong.
Exactly.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So you are literally guilty by association, whether or not you are a Christian oppressing any other group, whether or not you are a white person oppressing any other group. The thing is that if you are identified in that group, you're the oppressor by definition, correct?
By your identity group.
By your identity.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. So what makes it even more complicated is that you can simultaneously be an oppressor and one of the oppressed at the same time. So your guilt or innocence.
So who decided who the oppressed are and the oppressors are? Who got to make these decisions?
That's a good question. The writers of textbooks. And then they've been teaching our kids, they've been teaching our teachers, and now that's what everyone believes. So the society is about 20 years behind the university, 15 to 20 years behind the university. So I'm not sure exactly how it got started, but these men from the Frankfurt School were influential.
It's educators. That's
Yeah,
the short answer.
educators.
It's educators.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just going to offer up an answer to that. That would be the oppressors of academia.
The oppressors of academia are those who invented the class warfare.
Yeah. Yes. Academia. I think that's where it came from. So your guilt or innocence can decrease or increase depending on how many of these different groups you belong to. So a white woman would be considered one of the oppressed because she is a woman, while at the same time being an oppressor because she's white. So this is called intersectionality. So your oppressor groups, there's a grid. It's called intersectionality. The more oppressor intersections you have in your life, the more guilty you are. So let me say that again. The more oppressor intersections you have in your life, the more guilty you are. A white, heterosexual Protestant male in the middle or upper class, for instance, would be highly guilty. And you would need to give up, and if you were that person, you would need to give up some of your privilege, wealth, and power. A lesbian, black, Hindu woman, obviously, would be very innocent and worthy of some of the fruits of the redistribution of privilege, wealth, and power. So they're considered the gold mine of intersectionality. A black, lesbian person in the poor class would be the gold mine of intersectionality. So this is the heart of intersectionality. And you guys may have heard that word before, but that's what it means. So with Marxism 2.0, the categories are different, but the end result is the same. The redistribution of wealth, power, and privilege from those labeled as oppressors to those labeled as oppressed, based on the collective guilt of their assigned identity groups.
Charlie, I have
Yes.
a question. Hold on.
In Marxism 1.0, the two groups are pretty clear. And so it's easier for the one to overthrow the other or revolt against the other. But with all this confusion about what group you are in and how guilty you are, would that not tend to cause confusion among them as to who and when and how to go after the other group? I'm just trying to, you're saying the results are the same, and I'm trying to process in my own mind, would the results be the same because of the confusion that this is entering into? It's almost like everybody is fighting everybody.
Well, yeah, that's its design.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's not a bug. That's a feature.
But in Marxism 1.0, I was just reading about last night about how they pulled that off. You talk about that guy who went with the mass murders. How did they get the people to do those murders, to murder all those people? They paid them. They took money to get them to do that. I'm just trying to process in my mind how that was going to look like.
Well, I don't know exactly, but I do feel that there are certain categories that are kind of bubbling to the top. Because there are many of them. Like, you don't hear people talk about ableism much, you know. You don't hear people talk about ageism. That was one of them. I didn't even get into that one. Ageism. But race, and I think race, gender, and different types of gender identities, I think, are the ones that are rising to the top, and the others are going to fade away. But particularly race.
Yeah, I think there's...
Because of our country, especially in the United States, because of our country's history.
So I think there's two things, I think. One is you hit the nail on the head with, that's not a bug, that's a feature. The reality is if you fight everybody, the whole goal, what you have to do is you have to take down the current system. It's about chaos. and it's about breaking things. And so if you break the Constitution, if you break our form of government, if you break society, if you turn Christians against Christians, you turn churches against churches, ultimately the idea is if you buy into the lie, it doesn't matter whether or not you're confused about the different lies. The reality is it's destructive to the society, and if you can destroy this is why it's a 2.0. If you can destroy it, even by letting them just destroy themselves, you don't even necessarily have to get all the murder. You can just take down the whole system, and if you have the power, you can reinvent it, and then you can commit murder later on. The other piece is, I think we need to recognize that this is a spiritual battle. I think we have to understand that these are people raging against God. And these are people that are ultimately going to come to the doorstep of Christians because this is a spiritual battle. I don't think this is just simply economics. This is deeply spiritual. So I would argue, to Dad's point, how can this possibly work when they're all so confused? Well, God will be sovereign over that, but the whole thing is, it's about taking down anything that smells of biblical values and biblical principles, because it's about turning it all upside down. However they get there, they don't care. Whatever thing gets broken, it doesn't matter. That's the goal is.
The goal is destruction by whatever means. The destruction of the current system, so destruction of our country. Essentially, we're just talking about the United States. And then a rebuilding on Marxist principles. Again, they're in that oscillating stage where they want to destroy and rebuild something they think that's going to be better. It's not going to be better. They're going to have to do it again, and eventually utopia will arise. Let's see. So. Bodhi Baucham explains it this way. He explains it in 3 steps. Step 1 of social justice is to identify disadvantaged groups. And you can do that all day. You can do that all day. Different types of disadvantaged groups. It is not about the individual. It is about identifying groups that have disparate outcomes or different outcomes from other groups. So you're not allowed to ask why are the outcomes disparate because of step number 2. Step number 2 is to assign blame for those disparate outcomes. The reason is that wealth, power, and resources are seen as a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game. What this means is that if I don't have wealth, resources, or some other privilege, it is because someone else took it from me. And I need to take it back. So if I'm poor, it's because the rich man took it from me in some way, through a complex system that is the American system. So blame must be assigned. So that's why you will see the oppressed group, the group that has disparate outcomes, will always have somebody that did it to them in every single case. So if a particular group is having a negative outcome in a particular area, then we need to find out who's to blame for that. If this group doesn't do well academically, if another group doesn't do well economically, if this group commits more crimes, if this group is in prison more, if this group is not as well represented politically in the legislature, then we need to find out who is to blame and we need to fix it. Step 3 is that there needs to be a redistribution of power and resources to address those grievances between those who are deemed as disadvantaged and those who are deemed to be to blame. To suggest that the reason for the disparity lies within the group itself is not allowed. And that's ideological. So that's not because of reasons. Does that make sense? What they would call this, if you look for reasons within the group itself for the disparity, That is called victim blaming. You are not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to ask that question. So there could be statistical reasons, and that's why I love Thomas Sowell, is that he gets into that. What are the statistical reasons for this? If you start doing that, what you hear is, shut up. I don't want to hear your statistics. That's white supremacy. Statistics are white supremacy to keep us down. You are victim blaming with your statistics. So they're not allowed. The only answer is a redress of grievances. The trouble with this is that there are disparities, and there will always be disparities between different types of groups. And I hope, I'm not going to get into the reasons why that is, but I might get into that in future weeks. Social justice requires a redistribution of resources from those who have unjustly gained them. And by the way, all of those who have them are assumed to have unjustly gained them. All of those who have resources are assumed to have unjustly gained them, unless they are a member of one of the oppressed people groups. So if you are a white person who has acquired wealth, that is unjust. Period.
Okay.
Yes.
There's something true there, but there's something missing there. Because as the snowball continues to roll, if you are part of the oppressed group who is in a position of power, it only is valuable if you parrot the values of Marxism.
Right.
Otherwise, there's a developing issue. I forget what they call it, but it's that issue. And you can be a black person, but if your name is Clarence Thomas, you have white privilege, but even when you're black, okay?
Yeah.
You have that because if you don't, even though you might be in a position of power and authority, if you're not on their team saying their same message, you don't count. So you actually have to buy into the values and the belief in order to qualify. So
they want diversity, but they want diversity of skin color, not ideological diversity. They want ideological uniformity. So if you're not the right kind of black person, we are not interested in your voice.
right.
And you see that all over the place. Like, the guys that are black that are standing up against this are my heroes. They really are, because they take it on the chin in ways that none of us will ever have to. In the sense that they get called names. You know, it's awful what you see on social media, the way they're treated. Even by those who claim to be Christians. So again, we're talking about groups here. So you as an individual, I may have lost my spot. Yeah, you as an individual may not have done anything unjust yourself. You may have worked hard and with integrity to achieve success. But according to social justice, the justice of how you got to a place of success has nothing to do with what you actually did personally to get there, but everything to do with what group you belong to. So you as a straight white man could have clawed your way out of generations of poverty to make something of yourself. But ultimately, it does not matter. You are the privileged one. And if you stand shoulder to shoulder with the son or daughter of a wealthy, powerful black man, say like Colin Powell, and you're born into privilege and power, the answer is whatever they have, the sons of Colin Powell, whatever they have, they deserve. And whatever you have, you got it unjustly, and it needs to be redistributed. So in order to buy into ideological social justice, there are a number of presuppositions that you must accept. And these presuppositions are in direct opposition to the presuppositions of Christianity. So to rightly understand social justice, you must see it for what it is, a completely comprehensive worldview that covers everything. It's not just about redefining justice, though it is that. It touches everything. Epistemology, how do we know what is true? Identity, what is man at his core? Morality, how do we determine right and wrong? And authority, who or what should be believed and obeyed? There are those within Christianity who were trying to blend social justice with the tenets of Christianity. And it's happening a lot. And really that's the only reason why I'm even talking today, is because of that. I want to head that off with as many believers as I can. Neil Shenvi, if you get a chance, look up Neil Shenvi. He has a lot of good materials about this.
What's the spelling of that last name?
Shenvi, S-H-E-N-V-I. He rightly says, I worry that too many people are trying to hold on to both Christianity and critical theory. That is not going to work in the long run. We'll constantly be forced to choose between them in terms of values, priorities, and ethics. As we absorb the assumptions of critical theory, we will find that they inevitably erode core biblical truths. And I actually see this happening with my friends on social media. Not friends that go to my church or here, but other friends from previous times in my life. I see them slowly becoming apostate as they keep adopting the tenets of critical theory. And it's really hard to watch. So I think I'm going to end here. But what I would like to do next week is dig into the core worldview presuppositions of ideological social justice and contrast them with the biblical worldview. So I think that's where we will go next week.
Just a couple things I want to
Sure.
bring up.
I'm done. Yeah.
Guys, this is, I hope it's not lost on you, the importance of what we're going over here today. As being described and as being talked about, that this is the ideological and religious battle that we are facing now. As Kelly said, the blending of Marxist ideology and Christianity is happening all over the place. And it doesn't come in with the name Marxism, okay? It comes in the name of love, okay? It comes in the name of justice, whether or not it has the word social with it or not. And each one of us here, and again, what he's going to get into next week are the issues of how Marxism redefines all of the things that we understand in the biblical worldview. You're going to hear next week about what is the Marxist view of sin. We already got a taste of that, right? Marxist view of sin has to do with your skin color, your socioeconomic status. The sin is being in those guilty categories that, again, it's almost hard to understand because we think of things of, did I do that or did I not do that? In social justice, in Marxist doctrine, you don't have to have done anything. You have to belong to that class. And that's your original sin. That's the sin that needs to be repented of. And we've seen this in many, I know some of you young people maybe not have seen some of these things in the news and where police chiefs are asked to kneel down in repentance of their white privilege. This is very, very real, and I'm very thankful for Kelly to come and bring this type of study to us. It is extremely important to understand, and there is sometimes
there's some concern. We really didn't get into all of the Bible tonight, right? But that's okay. We're getting there, right? But the reality is, this is a religious view, and we are studying a false religion. And you have to know what that false religion is attacking us with. We have to describe it. And we do this in many other areas as well. You do this when you're talking about parenting. You're talking about actual practical applications in life. And then you also, of course, are getting into the scriptures. There's so many different things, but it's extremely important to understand, what does the Christian worldview have to say against these false religions that we face. And so we have to understand, quote unquote, the enemy, that we might know what tool in our toolbox, what verses, what scripture that we need to have then to combat this type of worldview. I hope you know the quote unquote privilege that you have to be here tonight to study these things and hear these things. This is a big deal. What you don't realize is how few churches are having this conversation. We are extremely privileged to be actually considering these things and talking about these things and warning us about these things, because it is so prevalent in our society. Again, education, media, politics, all of these things have this stuff infused in it. And if you're not awake to it, if your eyes aren't open to it, and if you aren't able to discern and understand what is coming at you, it is easy to be swallowed up by it, because it comes at you saying, don't you love people? Don't you believe in justice? And it is aggressive. It wants to eat you for lunch. The devil wants to take your mind, and wants to make you fight other people, wants to make you give up on the biblical worldview. And we have to be would we like to be talking about something a little more nice and cheery or whatever? Of course. But this is the world that we live in, as we mentioned this morning. We live in Corinth. We live in a pagan world. And so we can't pretend that things are different than they are. This is the world that our children are growing up in. This is the world that we are facing. And so I hate, we have a little extra time, but I normally hate to try to add on to or whatever. My goal is not to add on to what Kelly is saying. My goal is to put an asterisk, a star by it, that you might pay close attention. I hope it's clear for you. I hope you're working at it. I know some of these things are not going to be easy for you. Mom and Dad, I think you're going to have to do a little work to ask your children these questions. Work through it yourselves. This is not going to be a one-shot deal of, okay, we talked about it and now we got it. This is going to be a long-term discipleship effort, because this is what the world that your young people are growing up in. And so we need to be able to defend ourselves. Kelly?
What I'll say is, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some of these people's names to my bibliography that I brought that first week of other resources. Like, as I'm developing this stuff, I'm getting it from these other people, and I didn't add that stuff at the beginning. I'll start bringing that every week. So if I say a person's name and you want to know more about that person, I'll have that available.
No, thank you. Ultimately, what Kelly's saying is you're going to have the opportunity to further study this for yourself, to understand that this isn't just invented or just our own thoughts, that these are actually things that are being written on, and the Marxists are telling us who exactly they are. And there are those who are combating it, who are doing some good work as well. So we'll have the opportunity to study more and to look these things up and to work out that.